When a drone reaches St. Petersburg, a ceasefire keeps producing funerals, a festival in Ohio turns into a shooting scene, and a former congressman walks out of prison with a presidential pardon, the real story is not disorder. The real story is who gets protected, who gets pressured, and who gets told to accept all of it as normal. Today's headlines look unrelated at first glance. Ukraine is striking deep inside Russia again after Putin brushed off Zelensky's proposal for direct talks. In the Middle East, the gap between the official ceasefire stall and the reality on the ground keeps widening. In Ohio, police are still searching for suspects after a mass shooting near a community festival. And on the political side, Trump has pardoned a former Republican congressman convicted of insider trading, while a separate story out of Britain shows how donor influence and speech policing can shape an entire government. We're going to line up what these reports actually say, compare the different angles, and talk about what the headlines leave out. Because once you connect the dots, this stops looking like a random collection of news items and starts looking like the same power logic repeating in different countries. If you're getting value from this breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Start with the Ukraine story because it tells you a lot about how this war is evolving. Russian officials said residents in St. Petersburg were told to stay inside after a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack reached the city and the surrounding region. Moscow says it shot down hundreds of drones. Kyiv, for its part, is openly pointing to the fact that these strikes are now reaching about 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory. That detail matters. It's not just a military update, it's a political signal. Putin had just rejected Zelensky's offer for a direct meeting. Then, almost immediately, Ukraine shows it can reach one of Russia's most symbolic cities. St. Petersburg is not some remote outpost. It's Putin's hometown, a prestige city, and a place the Kremlin would prefer the public think of as far from the war. So when drones reach there, the message is obvious. This is not a conflict you can keep neatly off stage. But here's where the reporting gets interesting. Mainstream coverage often frames these strikes in terms of Ukrainian capability and Russian embarrassment, which is true as far as it goes. What it usually doesn't dig into is the larger strategic trap. If both sides are choosing symbolic escalation at the same time that they're talking about talks, then the diplomacy starts to look less like a path to peace and more like a backdrop for pressure. That's why Putin saying he saw no point in a face-to-face meeting is important, but not because it suddenly makes him the only obstacle. Zelensky's public letter to Putin was also clearly designed to provoke a response, criticize Putin personally, and put him on the defensive. So we're not dealing with one side sincerely reaching for peace and the other side refusing it. We're looking at a war in which both governments are trying to shape the story while improving their leverage. And there's another layer that barely gets mentioned. When drone warfare reaches deep into a country's interior, it makes civilian life part of the battlefield in a way that's hard to reverse. That means more fear, more air defense spending, more restrictions, and more domestic pressure to escalate rather than negotiate. Putin says he'll strengthen air defenses. Zelensky says things will only get worse for Russia. Those are not the words of leaders preparing their publics for compromise. So the headline may say one thing, but the underlying reality is harsher. The war is no longer just at the front line. It's becoming a contest over who can make the other side feel unsafe at home. And that's the pattern to keep in mind as we move into the Middle East, because the same structure shows up there too. Official language about control, a continuing war underneath it, and civilians stuck paying the price. Now to the story where the gap between headlines and reality is probably the widest. Depending on which article you read, you'll hear that there's a ceasefire in Lebanon, a temporary pause in Gaza, peace efforts in motion, or a diplomatic framework that's holding together. But the reporting from Drop Site, Al Jazeera, and other outlets makes clear that the word ceasefire is doing a lot of work here, because on the ground, the strikes continue. Israeli attacks have kept hitting Gaza, Lebanon, and parts of the West Bank. In Lebanon alone, multiple reports describe strikes killing civilians, medics, and even Lebanese military officers. One of the most striking details is that a brigadier general, a captain, and a soldier were killed in an Israeli strike on a Lebanese military vehicle. That is not a minor incident. That is not a side note. That is the kind of event that should make any serious ceasefire talk sound absurd. And yet the official framing keeps insisting that everything is under control. Here's what's buried. The agreement announced by the United States, Israel, and Lebanon reportedly demands Hezbollah pull back, stop firing, and accept zones under Lebanese army control, but it does not require Israel to fully withdraw or stop its own attacks. In other words, one side is being told to disarm and move back, while the other side keeps freedom of action. That is why Hezbollah called the deal illusory. Whether someone agrees with Hezbollah or not, the complaint is easy to understand. A ceasefire that keeps one side under permanent threat is not a balanced peace plan. It is coercion with a diplomatic label. The same imbalance shows up in Gaza. Articles describe implementing the first phase, or moving toward a second phase, but Palestinian families are still being killed, entire neighborhoods are still being hit, and Israeli forces are still enforcing barriers and control measures that make temporary war look a lot more permanent than temporary. One report described a grandfather in Gaza saying, in effect, that the war only ended for one side. That sentence says more than 1,000 polished diplomatic quotes. Meanwhile, the mainstream coverage often treats this as a puzzle of procedure. Which minister said what? Which delegation arrived in Cairo? Which mediator is irritated? That's useful, but it misses the central fact. If bombs continue falling, then the ceasefire is being used as a political word, not a human condition. The same thing shows up in the U.S. role. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says sanctions relief for Iran depends on nuclear concessions. President Trump says the war is over, while at the same time admitting that Israel's attacks on Lebanon are complicating the talks. The U.S. also struck an oil tanker in the Gulf and kept imposing financial pressure on Iran through sanctions on crypto exchanges and shipping routes. So which is it? Is the war over, or is it just being managed in layers? The answer seems to be that Washington wants the benefits of saying the war is winding down without giving up the tools of pressure that keep it going. That includes sanctions, maritime interdiction, military strikes, and diplomatic demands that leave the other side with very little room to move. Even the economic angle is impossible to ignore. One analysis pointed out that the fighting and the blockades are pushing up costs far beyond the region. Fertilizer, diesel, shipping, and consumer prices all feel the impact. So when leaders talk about stability, they're often talking about a version of stability that exists mostly in press releases. And there's one more thing the coverage keeps soft-pedaling. Israel's repeated strikes on medics, rescue workers, and Lebanese army personnel do not look like accidents in a messy war zone. They look like a deliberate message that no uniform offers protection if the target is in the wrong place. That changes the meaning of every future negotiation. If you zoom out, the bigger picture is hard to miss. This isn't a ceasefire that ended a war. It's a war reorganized around new rules of pressure. Switching gears for a second, the domestic stories today fit the same pattern in a different way. In Toledo, Ohio, multiple people were shot near a community street festival. Police are still searching for suspects. No grand theory is needed there. It's just another reminder of how quickly public life can turn dangerous when violence breaks through into ordinary spaces. A festival should be the most normal kind of event there is. Instead, it becomes a crime scene in a headline. Now, pay Compare that with Trump pardoning Stephen Breyer, a former Republican congressman convicted of insider trading after he left office. Breyer was sentenced to prison, paid fines, and then got a full, unconditional pardon. Trump described him as distinguished. Breyer says he was the victim of political prosecution. Maybe you think the pardon was justified, maybe you don't. But the important point is the message it sends. If you're politically useful, connected, or part of the right network, the system can become extremely forgiving. If you're ordinary, the rules are much less flexible. That contrast matters because it echoes how the foreign policy stories work too. Powerful actors negotiate their own escape routes, while regular people absorb the consequences. In one case, it's a pardon. In another, it's a ceasefire with loopholes. In another, it's sanctions and missile strikes. The form changes, but the privilege structure stays recognizable. Then there's the British story, which may be the most revealing of all. A long investigation describes how secret, undeclared pro-Israel money flowed through Labour Together and helped reshape the Labour Party. The piece argues that this machinery played a role in the banning of Hassan Piker and Cenk Uygur from entering the UK after their criticism of Israel. Whether you agree with every detail of that investigation or not, the broader point is hard to ignore. Speech suppression rarely happens in a vacuum. It usually grows out of donor influence, internal party discipline, and a media ecosystem that punishes the wrong criticism while pretending to defend open debate. Mainstream coverage often reduces these bans to security concerns or culture war noise. What gets left out is the political infrastructure underneath them. Who benefits when criticism of a foreign government becomes a border issue? Who benefits when journalists, commentators, and activists are treated as threats because they say the wrong thing about a war? And the answer, more often than not, is the same answer you see everywhere else in today's news: institutions that want to preserve a preferred narrative. That's why the Labour Together reporting matters beyond the UK. It suggests that the battle over speech, especially on Israel and Palestine, is not just about public outrage. It's about organized political projects, donor networks, and a willingness to use smears, pressure, and procedural power to keep dissent at the margins. So when people ask why these stories belong in the same video, this is why. Ohio, Washington, and Westminster are all showing different versions of the same thing: a public told to trust the system, while the system quietly arranges exceptions for itself. If you strip away the branding and the official language, today's news says something pretty blunt. First, wars are being sold as manageable, even while they spread into civilian life, logistics, and domestic politics. Second, ceasefires are increasingly being used as asymmetrical arrangements, where one side keeps the right to strike and the other side is told to stand down. Third, political systems are far more protective of insiders than they are of the public. And finally, speech about these wars is getting narrower, not broader, especially when criticism lands too close to the people funding or defending the policy. That combination is why the headline's still fragmented, but the reality feels coordinated. The biggest takeaway from today is that escalation and diplomacy are happening at the same time, not one after the other. The second is that a ceasefire is not meaningful if strikes keep landing and one side keeps freedom to continue. The third is that political privilege still shields insiders, whether that shows up as a pardon, a donor-backed party machine, or a speech ban. And the final takeaway is simple: if you only read the headlines, you get events. If you connect the reporting, you see a system. The stories we cover today are all different on the surface, but they point in the same direction once you zoom out. So I want to hear your take. Which part of today's coverage do you think is being most heavily sanitized? And what do you think the public still isn't being told? If this breakdown helped you make sense of it, hit the like button, subscribe to Daily News, and drop a comment below. Tomorrow's episode will dig into the next layer of this war and power cycle, and you're going to want to see that one too.